We're a little behind in time here, but Kevin has joined us from Leader Evaporator. He's been with them for a number of years. He is now out in the field, and he was actually in a conference, in-person conference in Wisconsin the last couple of days, and he's kindly joined us before he flies off to the airport. So today's session is on filtering syrup, and we'll Kevin or John will advance the screens as we go, and there'll be questions at the end, and Leader has kindly so over to you, Kevin. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And I think I have full control here of this screen. So happy to be here at this virtual event. I know that traveling, everybody's been kind of on their own and doing these. So I can't see these, but I'm happy to be doing this. So talking some about syrup filtering today, and start with talking about gravity filtering. And then we're going to move in a little bit to DE and Filterate, and then into filter presses as well. Asked those questions. I love the feedback back and forth, and trying to help everyone of all sizes. So we'll start with gravity filtering overall. Starting out with kind of the basics, vertical tanks, see them in the field over a number of years. There's round, and these happen to be square, but 1, 2, and 3 cone tanks have been pretty common over the years, have been around a long time. The canners, a bunch of different style canners overall. The self-contained kind of flat filtration, top rack and cover canners, various sizes. The one advantage there initially is that you have a base heat unit in the bottom generally that you can kind of on the side of the operation as a whole, moving into that, but is nice. I see a lot of these kind of in the field all over the country, but I call them homemade contraptions. Usually it's your starting point, but a kitchen pot, some sort of an open container and a wire, and something you make up on your own that you usually start with. And then you realize that, well, heat loss is problematic with filtering, and it's usually detrimental to getting through filtering. So it does work initially. But, getting into kitchen pots, sometimes they're not always stainless steel. They may not always be steel at all. They might be some sort of plastic. Make sure you're using food grade containers. It's the first step to, if you're starting small and where you want to be, you start there and move up. So filters, cone filters generally, synthetic and wool are pretty much what we see now. Synthetic being the one that's the most popular now, but wool, there's a bunch of wool in the field, works fine. Part of the reason why the changeover happened from wool to synthetic, some is because it does shrink some. Over time, it tends to wear out a little faster, and then storage and moths can be an issue with wool, but both seem to work fine. They filter very well. For pre-filters, looking at pre-filters here, pre-filters are used for most every operation now in filtering systems that are gravity. And in some cases, you can stack those pre-filters into cone filters. It seems to work well for most people using them. And then as the larger debris is filtered out in the beginning, you pull out that pre-filter and continue to use those layers of pre-filters. But that does remove the initial mineral debris before it tends to plug up those cone filters. Flat filters in those canning units, they work very well. It's a little bit different in how you filter. Generally, most people take a bucket of some sort and draw off from the evaporator, and then they kind of pour into those flat filters. They work just fine. Same deal there. You're going to take that and have an actual regular synthetic filter base, and then pre-filters can be put in those as well in various sizes. It can increase the surface area some, depending on the size of the canner, but they are a little clumsier to handle than cone filters, depending on your operation. But they work well. So for anybody that's really using filters and have used them in the past, care is crucial to these filters. Storage over the year, if you want to keep that and not buy new every year. Many people have to store or should store in a food safe compartment somewhere that is, not in the barn or the sugar house, potentially in the house, somewhere that, there's no mice or any other insects that can get in those. But checking those after a year's worth of use is important. Usually what I'll do on a filter is kind of lift it up, and I'll take a look at the light consistency in it on the back side and just make sure there's nothing that I see that looks different through that filter. If you see changes in the light, generally that's going to be a weak spot for the filter over time. And it does happen. They don't last forever. A big one, smell or musty odor on those filters, again, is key. Looking at that filter over time, they can get a little musty odor, or tend to get they have some smells over time. So trying to reduce that, or at least getting that care and making sure that you clean it before you put it away, again, is key. With cleaning, hand wash only on filters. Some people try to put them in a dishwasher or put them in a washer. Really no soaps or chlorine or any detergents or anything with these filters. The syrup leaches flavor, and I have that on another slide, but syrup leaches anything that you're going to put in that, and it tends to hold that in the filter. So mothballs included. If you have wool filters, mothballs will also stay in those filters, and you're going to have pretty poor flavored syrup by putting some detergents in there. So hand wash, some people use steam, and by steam I mean on the evaporator. They tend to start by washing as well as they can, and then heating them up on top of a syrup pan. That seems to work okay. Generally, it's better to start them wet before you use them, but steam can work to your advantage if you have that available to you. And then just kind of generally, all filters can be challenging to keep clean. After the first few uses, the syrup, the niter and mineral small particles, they tend to plug those filters up. Most people that have used filters over the years, that's the one conversation we always have is, what's the best way to clean? How can you keep them clean year after year? It's challenging. Sorry for the background noise here. Whoop. Go to previous here. Give me a second. Yes. Oh. Okay, my computer's acting up here. Oh. Give me a second. Okay, so looking into the filter press and looking at various sizes, there's a couple different sizes of filter press overall. There's smaller filter presses, hand presses, medium-sized presses, and large presses by looking at those filters. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm going to make this first. This slide's more important to start with. So looking at making the switch to a pressure filter press. I use the word pressure filter because that's what a lot of people use. You are using pressure to actually move that syrup through that. Understanding your market is key by whether or not you're ready to move into a filter press. Some people that sell through plastic only in their markets, you really can't see that niter versus using a gravity and pressure filter. So if you jump into glass, or you're seeing your market switch to glass, or maybe that's what you want to sell exclusively glass, and you haven't ever sold in this way, understanding your market is key, because there is a very noticeable difference in retail syrup customers when they will see the difference. And for anybody that hasn't seen, usually at a seminar, I'll hold up one that's there and one that's been gravity filtered and one that's been pressure filtered. And there's a significant difference in view from clarity, in some cases from niter that can actually settle back down to the bottom. depending on how well you did your filtering. And then time. Anybody, again, that spends a bunch of time washing cone filters as a whole, the time savings alone, although you're going to spend some time changing over and cleaning the press, the time savings is significant and more enjoyable than trying to clean filters every day. And then growth in taps and sap. I kind of call it a graduation. You kind of graduate from, again, the kitchen pot and wire to the cone filter setup, and maybe you add some sort of a canner there, or even the same single cone filter. You graduate through as you grow in taps, and you have more sap that comes in, and you're like, I'm ready to move into that next stage. That canner now just becomes a canner with a cover, and then the actual filter press are separate units. So again, looking at the starting points of filter presses, just to kind of identify where and what these are. Gear pumps with these filter presses in many various sizes have been widely used and generally reliable. That bronze pump, it's called an Oberdorfer, is relatively inexpensive compared to the rest, but it will wear out over time. So anybody using that, in some cases it could wear out after a year or two. So just be wary of that. I can tell you that the original bronze gear pump, the Oberdorfer, is discontinued from the company. They tried to put what they called a lead-free pump out in the market, and that failed kind of in the first year or so. We're actively looking for other options for that specific pump, but right now I don't think anybody has a bronze option. Stainless steel pumps are an option, but again, they're great for those pumps. They're just more similar to the price of an air pump. They're not inexpensive, but they seem to work pretty well from what I've seen. The one that has kind of taken over for anybody that's stepping up into a filter press generally is the air diaphragm pump. The air diaphragm is dependable, long-lasting, user-friendly, but does come at a cost. So it is a higher price pump. But the nice thing with that pump overall is it's very versatile. You can use that pump for many different things. Some, in this case, if you look at that picture that's here, that's a disconnect hose. Depending on your operation, you can use that disconnect hose to pump sap in certain places. You can pump syrup and or drain, pump back into syrup pans. Some people have set it up for many different uses. It's we kind of use. We use it to its bare minimum. We push it with pressure, but we don't really push it with volume. So it's a great pump. Works in many different ways. And then the hand diaphragm, and there's a few different style diaphragms, but the one that I see the most is the hand diaphragm in the handle pumps in the hand press. We have one on our hand press pump, but there's many different ones on the market. Works fine. It's great value. It's inexpensive. I seem to anybody that's starting out or wants to step from a cone filter or a filter tank into a filter press, this is a great place to start. They don't build the pressure that any of the air pumps or any of the other pumps build by hand, but you can modify them. Some people modify them on like a pulley system. Some people have taken them and put a longer handle on them. Depending on what you have there, you can modify them to actually increase pressure. But the smaller handle styles and those smaller presses, that's about what they do. So they work just fine for anybody getting into it, whether it's a 3, 7-inch plates, or I think there's some 5-inch out there. There's a variety of different things out there for hand pumps, but they seem to work fine. The diaphragms do wear. Before I switch to the next page, the diaphragms on those do wear over time. I know, like they generally with liquid they're okay, but depending on where you store them, if they spend a lot of time in the light, they'll wear down even faster. Okay, so plate and frame types. For anybody that's seen plates and frames over the years and filter presses, there's a few different styles. And I always kind of mention this because people ask me, well, what about the wide? What about the wide frames? What about the narrow frames? So they started for a while, for the most part, with narrow frames. That was the old cast iron style, and there were some others that had that narrow frame. And the narrow frame works just fine. and it really depends on region. But two things I say is if you have a wide frame, it's generally better for nighter space for most of the season. But there is a time when that narrow frame can have its uses. Surface area matters when it's difficult to filter syrup. So that's when you have more space and more filters and more layers. In this case, this filter press down here has stacks of layers there during those later parts of the season that you don't really have the niter issue. What you have is generally a bacteria issue, or the pH has changed there, and it can be more challenging to actually filter syrup. So those two you see in the market, some are wider than others, and again, some are narrow as well. Waffle plates for the actual to hold against the papers, that's the most common by far. There is that stainless steel plate on the polycarbonate presses that is flat. That's welded to the polycarbonate that works also. One thing I'll mention about waffle plates that I think is important for anybody using a press or buying a press on the market, maybe it's used, is if you're having an issue with you cannot get waffle plates you can't get papers to stop blowing even at low pressures, a waffle plate can really be the culprit overall. What I would do is take your hand and run your hand over that waffle plate and just check and feel if there's any burrs or anything that feels sharp on your hand. All those waffles should have a nice finish, but they should be pretty smooth. You shouldn't have any burrs, and it really depends on where those plates and frames are coming from, and depending on if they're a new company that started up and decided to build these or whatever it's from. Just be wary of that, because if it is sharp in any way, they'll blow papers fast. There's pressure against every one of those waffle plates. So those waffles, it's just important that they're smooth. So a couple different press types. Again, the most common on this list is aluminum. Cast iron was there. I've seen some of those presses still hanging around. There's a few stainless as well. Stainless tends to be pretty expensive to manufacture, but I've seen a few stainless and then polycarbonate as well with those smaller presses. So again, the aluminum is the most common from small to large presses for over many years. That's what you're going to see in the market. So size presses accordingly, and this is a bit of a variable, and that's why I made the numbers such a variable overall. It's helpful to know, people are asked, they will ask, where do I start? Where do I want to be? Well, it's important to know your gallons of syrup per hour and day, but size yourself accordingly with some of these presses. So all I can say is, you can talk to anybody that's using these or selling these, they'll kind of guide you in the right direction. But generally speaking, the hand pump presses, 15 gallons of syrup, 5 to 15 it's a pretty good run for most people that have a 2x6 evaporator. And again, the smaller presses, as you jump up, you're going to jump up in size and scale. And then the big presses, 200 plus gallons on some of those. It's a significant amount of syrup. In some cases, it's many, many more. And like this press here on the right, it's many more gallons for flow. But generally, there's some ways to get around that. Looking at small batch syrup, you can save some syrup up over a period of time. If you happen to be in, maybe you don't feel like you're big enough at this point, or you don't have that much syrup on either a little half pint style evaporator or maybe a home model, you can save syrup up and keep it cool, separate it, and then reboil. And then you can reheat and filter and then bottle it once if you want. That works just fine. It tends to work the best directly out of the evaporator, but if this is your option, this is your option. A lot of people do this over time. They'll wait to 3 to 5 days to get through this and then filter and reheat. Color and density will be affected by that. So every time you reheat, especially if you're mixing syrup together, one thing that happens some is that if you take a lot of light syrup and mix a little bit of darker syrup into it, it doesn't take a lot of dark syrup to darken the whole batch. So just be wary of that. If you're really concerned about grade or your market is dependent on a certain type of syrup or a certain time of year, just blending it all together is how this market survived in the world. But in general, for your own market, be wary of that it will affect that. Again, looking at general use to gallons per hour and day. A press kind of too large will lengthen the interval and cool the syrup. So happens quite a bit. I see people that, they got their buddy down the road or someone they got a deal on online. They've got, maybe they have a 2x6 evaporator and they really need a 7-inch or a 7.5-inch filter press. They get this giant 10-inch, or maybe they even have bigger and get a 15. If you're using that press as complete and you fill it up, it's generally going to really cool that syrup down and affect how well it filters long term. If the interval is too long and you have a container that's just sitting there uninsulated, which is great, it's going to cool that syrup down. It tends to work better if you can continue to move that syrup at its density and move it through the press so it maintains that temperature. Air pumps actually can assist with that process, because you could take that air pump as a whole and you can actually just crank that air pump on so it kind of chug. So it's just real slow. Works very well to do that, and then it pumps through that system and it keeps everything moving, but doesn't just run it down through that. So if you have a larger press, that is one way to get through that. Another way, which generally is the first stop, is to get a filter press stop plate. Use it on a larger press, or even a small press that maybe you're just too big for to start. And then you can reduce the paper on a small day if you have a small run over the season. The nice thing, and I see some people do this as well, is if you start small, you think maybe that that you buy in sap and the extra batch of sap comes in today, then I'll take that and use that stop plate to start, and then extend that stop plate as I run through, and I don't have to waste the extra papers and change the whole press. I just keep adding the papers to the press. So a lot of advantages with going into a filter press stop plate, and pretty much they're made for all sizes. I mean, I'm sure every company at this point has a variety of sizes to offer on those presses. And for anybody, I know that Brian mentioned this before, but for anybody looking at trying to understand where their stop plate generally goes, looking at the left to right here, the inlet side, the plate itself. If anybody can see on the right, I guess it's just my screen that I can't see. The frame, the wider frame is all the way to the right, and the waffle plate. Even though my graphic design skills are really minimal, the waffle plate below, you see the smaller rectangular box is the waffle plate. Generally, that you want it at the end of the plate on that, so that you get the full use of the frame. So if anybody can see here, my mouse, this frame, it's got that, it generally runs in and runs out both sides into those plates. And you can put it in front, you can put it one more step to the left here and use that waffle plate, the end plate right here. It's not going to hurt the press at all. You're just not going to fully utilize the whole frame. So if you wanted to use both sides, you're putting a paper all the way through each one of these, you can utilize the whole frame. It's just one extra piece there and it works just fine. So there's really no wrong way to do it, but this generally is the way I'd recommend. So filter aid. This one is one, again, I get a lot of questions about, and where do you put, how do you put filter aid in? When do you put filter aid in? Well, again, it works best if you have a small kind of draw-off tank or some sort of a pail in that with just for the filter press. That DE is kind of like the consistency of flour for the most part. It's real fine. It does coat in the papers and assist syrup flow. So in that process overall, when you're looking at that, without it, your press is going to it'll jump in pressure pretty fast, but it will stay in the press. So you're going to go through filter aid during a season. So, but there's many grades. So just make sure that when you're going through and buying this filter aid overall, that you're using a high food grade. And again, all the manufacturers make sure we stock that. If you know what you're buying, sure, you can probably find it on Amazon, but in most cases, pool grades don't work or they don't work as well. So just be wary of that. And then how much? Again, the question is how much? Well, the answer that some of you have probably heard up there for years is enough. And the answer from Bruce was always enough. But in general, you're looking at 3 cups per 5 gallons to start. So if you're starting out a batch and you're getting going and you haven't made any, be at that rate to start when you first start with new papers in a new press. If you're more than that, obviously you have to up those cups. If you're less, do the math and do the same thing there. And then for most parts of the season, you can scale back to about 1 cup per 5 gallons after that, after you generally start with that 3 cups per 5. So somewhere in that range is a good starting point, but it's a bunch of variables. So it may not always be there. Again, looking at inspecting the colors in the filter press plates are key to the operation. It should be light-ish color, but compare your syrup color to niter color. If you've got very light syrup and your niter's there, it will be light-ish color. But if you have light syrup and or dark syrup and you're very, very light through that press, you probably can pull that back a little in niter or in Filtrate. If you see that kind of tannish, sandyish color for the most part, that's about right. But if you're seeing every single one that you have packed full, every frame that you have packed full there with this Filtrate, again, compare where you're at and see what the color is, because that does matter. Oops. So anyway, as far as color and looking at the filter press as a whole, just so I keep that up for another minute or so, the 3 cups per 5 gallons, 1 cup per 5 gallons is your starting point. I'm going to mention here in a minute about time of year can have an effect on how much your starting point is at. But again, inspect your press, inspect your color. So operation with presses, and this is a little bit more of an art form as a whole. But looking at blown papers, people ask me, when do I know I blew a paper? Well, if you're someone that's there by the press quite a lot, the first thing you need to do is inspect the syrup, because you'll see it in the syrup. But you can hear it in a press generally with a pump. It's going to change the pump speed. It'll sound different for a second. It'll sound like it's consistent and smooth, and all of a sudden it'll rev up for a second or change speed. So generally speaking, that's a pretty good indication that you've blown a paper. 50 psi on the filter press paper is what they're rated at. Anybody that's using it that looks at that gauge, that pressure gauge on that, be pretty religious about making sure that you maintain that 50 psi. I can tell you that there are in some cases, I don't mean to stop. I don't know if that's bothering anyone if I talk over that, but the filter press paper at 50 psi in that gauge is your indicator. Some people try to push that well beyond 50 psi, especially on a bigger press, because they know that they have big, heavy aluminum frames and plates. The press itself will hold that, but as a general rule, the papers will not. So one time blowing those papers can be kind of disastrous and takes a lot of extra time to go through and fix that mistake, especially if you're pumping into barrels. I can tell you that just personal experience, if it happens and you either miss it or you push it too hard, you're going to spend less time changing a filter press out than you are trying to figure out how you're going to get the filter aid and niter back out of a barrel. So be wary of that in the future. And again, if you're looking at that 50 psi in the filter press paper, if you're using a filter press and tighten it down, especially some of the models where maybe you push it too hard, you can blow syrup in all directions, up in the ceiling, all over everything you have in the sugar house. And the most dangerous is on people. So you can blow syrup on people. Hot syrup on people generally doesn't make them very friendly, but it can happen. So I see a chat here. Sure, I can go over that here. I tell you what, somebody asked me about going over the inspecting color on a filter press again. I'm going to go a couple slides ahead and then I'll go right back to that, because it's going to be talking about kind of the same thing. So anyway, blowing syrup in all directions is generally a very bad thing. Cheaper papers doesn't usually pay. And again, we're not the first company or first industry that's ever used filter press paper. There are variations online you can get. You can generally spend a lot less for paper sometimes that aren't designed for maple, but they will blow a lot faster. Some people tell me, well, I just double up on papers. I'm like, well, then you're you're doubling up on price as well. So, they will blow a lot faster. They may not filter as well, and the pressures will be spiked. So cheaper papers are cheaper for a reason. Don't over tighten press. Again, I've seen all kinds of things. I had one gentleman, and I don't know where it was, but they had a press that they like to push it, too hard. And when they pushed it too hard, they decided, well, I could just take these tighteners on there, and I could put a long pole on this tightener. I'll just use a 4-foot pole on the tighteners. Well, that's just going to amplify your problem, and then there's always the chance of warping a press or an end plate of some sort, because you're putting a lot of pressure on those on that end. Usually doesn't pay to over tighten those. They're designed to tighten, hand tighten, not designed to tighten with big long poles for leverage. So what effect can a filter press have on really, or what are the effects that can be from and used from a filter press? So again, these are things I look at when people talk about having a really hard time getting through a all season on a filter press. They say that my press just seems to work hard always. So there's a couple things to look at that maybe you can update your operation that may help. The first thing, and I think one of the most important things, is bacteria. It can be caused in many ways. You can get bacteria from anywhere. We all have it. It's part of the system. In some cases, it can help us. When it comes to filtering, it usually does not help us. Holding sap in old sap causes bacteria. So anybody in their system that waits, maybe you're a weekend warrior, or you couldn't get to it, you broke down, whatever the reason is, especially if it's at a place where the temperature is spiked. Maybe it's outside, plastic tank that's transferring sap. Whatever the reason is, overall, holding sap is usually detrimental to a filter press. Usually boils okay. Can go through a RO machine fine, and then at the end, the filter press is the cause or the effect of challenge. It makes it challenging for the filter press. So, the tree to the container as fast as possible usually is your best defense against all of your equipment. So a filter press, you'll see it. Black tubing, and this is one that some people they don't quite understand. But black tubing, it heats up sap. It works just fine through the system, and for the most part of all year, it's totally fine, boiling, and it makes great syrup. There's no effect on syrup quality besides the temperature and then how it can filter. So increased bacteria can really affect the filter press operation. Poor draining tubing systems, and again, this kind of goes back to if your sap is sitting in areas that don't drain, or pools in systems that are through the woods that aren't very tight. And the longer it sits, the more it heats up, the more bacteria it's going to have in the system, and it's kind of like holding sap in a lot of ways. It ends up being old sap in the system. Sometimes pump lines can do this. If you have a pump line that doesn't drain as well, the ground usually is somewhere around 55 degrees. That's going to sit in that line until the next pump. So that just amplifies over time. That it can cause the filter press to work harder. Again, transferring or buying sap, this could be a tough one because you don't always know where your sap is coming from. You got your buddy on the road that maybe does a pretty decent job, and then sometimes the neighbor wants to get involved and they don't really understand all the things that you do about making syrup, and they put it in a container that's not approved, or they go they let their sap sit for a while. Who knows the reason? But controlling buying sap, or especially in transferring in plastic over a number of miles, can increase bacteria load, and again, it can affect your filter press. Late season syrup, this is always a tough one. And again, I think that I have another slide here, but late season syrup. Again, late season is always a challenge with making syrup. Everything starts to work harder from the RO machine if you have one. the evaporator, flow in the evaporator, and then all the way to the filter press can be challenging. So late season syrup is certainly a part of where you see the challenge in the filter press. So high bricks. I did want to mention this because, thinking about getting a filter press or thinking about increasing or improving your operation to an RO machine in any bricks level, but especially in high bricks, it transforms the operation and really increases the demand on the filter press because of your syrup per hour draws. Looking at a 2x6 evaporator raw sap, and let's say it's a 40 gallon an hour evaporation rate at 2% sugar, maybe you get a gallon per hour of syrup. You start looking at how much that changes to 8%. You're essentially going to quadruple that. And then, again, high bricks can significantly change the amount of syrup you're drawing off per hour. And in turn, significantly change how hard you're working that filter press, or it may be time to look at upgrading the filter press as a whole. So high bricks, again, just adding an RO machines changes the whole operation. And then recirculation time with an RO machine. If you're using one now, if someone recirculates a long time, and this happens quite often if you're not sized appropriately in every place, or you've grown too fast, or you're just not ready to buy something different. Recirculating can improve the operation, but if you recirculate too much, too often without cleaning enough, especially in a place that is warmer, in a room that's warmer, it will affect how the filter press operates because it increases sap temperature and increases bacteria load. So be wary of that when you're doing that. It doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means it's going to make it more challenging to work as effective as somebody down the road that might be doing it differently. So some key notes. Syrup leaches flavor. Syrup leaches a lot of flavor. From filters and pour storage to containers, sap and syrup storage as a whole. Any contaminants, the ones I see the most are food and fuel. If you happen to have a sugar house that you use, we're all experts for 6 or 8 weeks, and then we forget it exists, or we use a sugar house for something else, whether it's the repair shop or storage building or whatever it is. Fuel can be a problem. It may just be vapors. Vapors can be an issue as well. Vapor doesn't seem like it's an issue, but then you start talking about how wood-fired evaporators you can get leaches of flavor there and it's positive usually, but you usually get a little smoky flavor in syrup with someone that has a sugar house that they're an older style wood-fired evaporator. You see a lot of that as well. So it happens in wood, it's going to happen in fuel, and then food. If somebody's handling, if you're doing a barbecue there internally, especially if you have smoke from the barbecue, but even just hands, even your hands handling food can be a contaminant from the filter press papers to whatever you're stirring with, to whatever the reason is, it can be a contaminant in that syrup. So if you're going to get it and start there with syrup, the syrup itself will certainly pick it up. It's, there's a lot of variations in syrup, and in some cases, the variation may just be contaminants. One of the ones I think people forget about some is the compressors they have for their air pump may not always be drawing air from a very good spot. Again, the compressor is probably in the shop. Maybe the compressors over by where you store your four-wheelers or snowmobiles or wherever it is, and they start that two-stroke snowmobile up, and that compressor just sucks that air in. There is a filter in most cases on a compressor, but if there's not, especially, or if you're in a place where maybe you don't have the right air, that air pump is going to draw in through that press in some cases, depending on through your system, really. So be wary that compressors matter, for what you're using in that system. Too much filter aid. If you happen to be putting too much filter aid, and this is partly answering the question here in a bit ago, is that too much filter aid can cool your syrup in that operation. So if you're looking at that filter aid and comparing it to color, if you're dark syrup and you're significantly lighter in that, where maybe you have what I call maybe a dark robust, and your syrup is a white, almost like a whitish. The closer it is to that original filter aid before you put it in the syrup, obviously the more that you have generally. So if you're packing those tight, if you open that press up and there's just a real packed press in there, and it's very light, usually you can pull back the filter aid some. So try to maintain that three cups to 5 gallons, and then turning it down to about a cup per 5 gallons. But again, there's a few different ways to check that besides just color. For that question earlier is, one of the things that I tell people as well is that, looking at knowing your season is important. If you know your season timelines, and if let's say it's the end of the season, the syrup's going to work harder. Then it's just going to work harder. It's part of the process of making syrup. And then along with that, if you have, depending on what you're using in that system, that mid-season syrup, generally seems to work really well. It's your best time to filter overall. But I'm going to talk about it later a bit. And then temperature matters as well. So filtering hot, it's best if it's off the evaporator at 180 degrees plus, and anything above 190 really starts to build niter. But 180 to 190 seems to be our best bottling temperature. But right off the evaporator is the best. If not, make sure it's hot. If it cools, it's just going to work harder. And here we are, understanding seasonal timelines. So if you're using tubing especially, and you have some sap potentially that didn't get out of the woods, or maybe if you do clean tubing at all and you're going to use that and there's going to be some residual in there, that first part of the season can be a challenge to filter. Usually your first run, depending on how much you either let run on the ground, or maybe you're someone that wants to keep everything and just run it through. First bowl of the season tends to be the hardest to filter. Your early to mid-season time is your best or easiest filtering time. And I say best and easiest relative to the operation. Sometimes, you'll be at a place where, you'll be in a region that is just not a great place to filter, or maybe your woods isn't a great filtering woods. It happens where sediment, depending on what you have for mineral, maybe you have more or less niter in some of the woods. I know that when I go down to Ohio in some areas, I feel like you can shovel some of their niter out, every single day, where maybe in northern Vermont or northern Michigan. I'm not sure. Somebody will have to tell me how it is in your region in Ontario, but I can tell you in the States, it's kind of all over the map. What we see for bacteria growth in the East for things like RO machines, we usually find a lot more mineral buildup in the West. So it really changes. It's a variable by region. Mid-season, and I use mid-season is basically after that early to mid-season time for filtering, getting into the mid-season part all the way through towards the last part of the season. Usually it gets progressively worse as you filter. There can be days that, let's say you have a good run, maybe it's a 3-day run, usually starts pretty well, and then it gets progressively worse as the run continues on. If you get back to a freeze up and you're in that middle part of the season and you get another 2 or 3 day run and maybe it does well, you're going to see it again where you might find filtering is easier in the first part of the run and it progressively gets worse as the run continues. And then again, late season is the hardest time to filter. It's for anybody selling commercial syrup at this point, there is times where maybe a packer says, make it until you can't filter anymore. Maybe you're someone that's a hardcore retail seller and you just want to try to get as much syrup as you can. You get to a point where nothing seems to work right. It's hard to boil. It's hard to run through the RO machine, hard to clean the tanks, and then in this case, it's just hard to filter. Yeah, I guess that's mostly what I have, but I do want to go back a little bit. I know that I didn't want to not answer your question overall as far as looking at the color again. That's the first place to start, and then when you're going back to the season, looking at the time of season, thinking about where you are, and then the one other place that I go by looking at pressures and color and volume of DE is what is my press supposed to be doing. If you've got a press that is supposed to give you 50 gallons of syrup flow and you're at 10, and your syrup flow looks good, we need to start checking off the boxes of what's happening here. So, maybe it is that the syrup quality is down. Maybe it is that the time of year is affected or the color isn't quite right. So look at your filter plates and check those and see what they look like. If they're very, very full and it's light color, chances are you're probably going to have enough filter rate, if not too much in there. If your press seems to be getting to that 30 or 40 gallon mark of syrup, you can consider that a success through that press. Okay, there's a few more here. The air, generally no on air diaphragm. It generally does not. It was a compressor contacts the syrup. Generally no, but I do mention the air because I think the air is important as a whole to think about, especially if you have things like blowers in components in your evaporator, or just if you're using an air nozzle on compressors, you want to think about where your air comes from and how the filtration varies in your system. So that's a good one. Good question. So any recommendations on DE pre-charging? So essentially that's kind of what we're doing here with that 3 cups per 5 gallons on pre-charging the press. I have seen some pre-charging presses that you put some DE into the top and you mix it around and that's what you put through first. That seems to work okay as well. The only time that I see that there's an issue with pre-charging DE is if you try to run a small batch of syrup and a lot of DE right at the beginning, or you don't mix it very well. A gear pump can plug up pretty fast if you try to pre-charge with too much filter rate. And if you've ever used one that has plugged up, it's a frustrating few minutes when you don't know what's going on. It doesn't work. It just kind of cakes up in the actual bronze gear pump, and you have to go through and run hot water through it, and get it back working again because it will almost shut down. What about vacuum filters? So, and again, vacuum filters are fairly new into the market. I can't see why they don't work from the experience that we don't sell them at Leader, but something that I've seen in the market, I think they work just fine. And again, maybe someone else can chime in on what they have for use, but I can't see why they wouldn't work. It's an interesting idea. I don't know as far as total volume to the components of what you get in pressure filters because the system is a little bit different, especially in the larger presses, but I can't see why they won't work. I haven't seen any real volume of syrup quality through those vacuum filters, but some people that have had them say they work fine. What are the benefits of the other press types? Polycarbonate. So the benefits of the other press types, the polycarbonate, stainless, cast iron, and aluminum. So we'll start by talking about aluminum. That's kind of the standard in most of the industry. It's relatively inexpensive. Casting that in order to get a press built, you need to have somebody build you the plates and frames. It's relatively inexpensive, and if for most companies to get into it to use aluminum, it's as far as the one thing that happens for aluminum versus stainless steel is stainless, that 304 L stainless generally is what those are made out of. That's a food grade stainless that's real smooth. It probably is going to clean a little bit easier with stainless versus the aluminum. Aluminum almost has like a gritty surface, especially on the outside. So you'll need a brush to clean it when you're done if you're using it for a fair amount of time. In like a hot water, you just brush it off. Stainless is pretty fast to clean. Cast iron is going to be similar to aluminum. Cast iron, I wouldn't recommend if you're looking for a new press. There is some old presses out there that are still cast iron. And like anything, cast iron works, but it's like cooking. It works fine. It's for the most part, as far as I can tell, it seems to be food safe. It's heavy. It holds a lot of heat. And that usually is detrimental to presses by holding a ton of heat in that press. And then they're more prone to breaking if you drop one, where aluminum might divot or potentially warp a little bit. Cast iron can be a challenge. Polycarbonate is again a little bit newer, but polycarbonate has its uses as well. Polycarbonate won't last forever like generally a metal plate or press will, but the screen in those are virtually you can't blow paper with those style flat screens. So the polycarbonate does not heat like some of the other presses. It doesn't hold the heat, so generally it sends heat through, so it doesn't radiate, and you don't lose as much heat with polycarbonate as you do aluminum and stainless. But the sacrifice there some is that you also don't get as much syrup through them. You can't push them like you do a aluminum press. You can if you happen to not be paying attention or your gauge isn't working, you can usually push an aluminum press well past 50 psi. Not that I'd recommend it, but some people have, and if you push that in a polycarbonate press, the chances of breaking are much higher. So again, the stainless is new. I think stainless has its place. It's, obviously we know how stainless works in this market. It can be a standard. The only piece that is the most challenging and why it hasn't taken over the market is because it's stainless steel. It's not expensive. It would be a very expensive press, especially in the larger sizes. Hope that answers that question. General clarification. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about Filtration. Should be light in color in plates. Okay, so again, for the most part, you're looking for like a sandy tan color in your plates when you're done for Filtration. But there's some variables there. If you happen to have very dark syrup, you want it to be a full grade lighter than your syrup. But if you go from dark syrup to packed full plates that are very light in color, you're probably putting too much Filtration in, unless it's the end of the year and you need to add Filtration, because as your season progresses, you're going to find that 3 cups and 1 cup will not do it. You're going to spike in pressure immediately in that press. You're going to keep having to add more Filtration through that press. It's a little bit of an art form. It's not exactly cut and dry on how much to use. You're looking at how much your Filtration is packing your press, and by Filtration I mean the actual frames themselves, and then color compared to what your syrup color is as well. So if you're using that press, start with the three cups per 3 gallon or per 5 gallons, and then turn it down to 1 gallon per 1 cup, 1 cup per 5 gallons, excuse me, and then start there, and then move from there. As your season progresses, you're going to find it's going to increase, but that's a great starting point. That's what the majority of operation, that's where you start. Okay. Somebody said not legal in Ontario. Is that true? Cast iron is not legal in Ontario? Anybody know that? John?
Yeah, from when we did a review on it, it wasn't considered part of the food safe materials.
Okay.
Because everything has to be food safe in Ontario now, so they considered aluminum, plastic, and stainless to be the food grade materials that we can work with.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that at all. I didn't realize that. But yeah, cast iron, I mean, again, at this point, especially in Ontario, I guess it's time to switch that out if you have one. But yeah, there's a few left in the state. So
yeah, and there's probably a couple floating around up here too. So.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Do you have any tips to make sure there's no syrup left in the press? Well, the first thing is if you have a press that has a tray, that's the initial benefit, is that you can loosen that press up, and most of that syrup will drain out of it. I have seen some people that take and they almost put themselves into a secondary press where they have like a container they put some pressure on, and anything left for syrup in that press kind of works its way out, and then you get every single last drop of syrup in that press out. I can tell you that the last one, which I see a lot of people do, and this is dependent on what you feel like is important to you, is once you pump everything through your press, you can take sap and pump it through if you want, and reuse that sap. It will darken your syrup significantly, especially if you put it in the flue pan, which some people do. You can save all of that, and then once you get the sap through that unit, by sap I mean hot sap generally. It's usually out of your syrup pan somewhere. You can pump that hot sap through the press, and then continue to drop in sugar level by the next stage might be sap that's a little bit less sweet, or just water. At that point you feel like you have enough there, and you can take that water again, and that water can be also recycled in the evaporator as well. So it all depends on how much waste you want, and if you want to keep every single drop, you can. You can press all that Filtration that's there to make sure there's nothing left. Or if you're a bigger producer, maybe, or you understand there's going to be some loss. The unfortunate part is that any press that you have that's a pressure filter, and really any press as a whole, it's difficult to have 100% of that you save. You're going to have a little bit of loss. That's just that's kind of part of the deal.
Well,
More
thank you,
questions?
Kevin. I think we answered all the questions in the chat. Is there any questions that anyone wants to ask personally? Just unmute yourself and go ahead.
No one's going to beat me up personally. That's okay.
No, it doesn't. I don't think anybody wants you to miss your plane.
Oh, and I have plenty of time now. Actually, they wouldn't let me go through because this is a smaller airport, so there's really no one here. There's a few people I've seen now walking in, but I'm kind of surprised. I'm an hour behind here, but I was kind of surprised at the lack of people working here that I see. So I'm in the
Well, Kevin, I think this was very informative. It's always a question we get, and you know the standard answer is what you've given. How much filter rate? Enough. You know, and you have to learn it. But sizing your press, whether it's a manual press, or a pressure, is important. And I've always said the second thing that a sugar maker should buy after an evaporator is a filter press, because it's the only thing that makes your syrup clean. So thank you for that. Leader has always been a great supporter of OMSPA, and they have offered a $100 gift certificate today that they'll send to John Williams, and then John will send it to Gail Cranston, who is the winner of this session's gift certificate. So Gail, you'll just have to wait for John to get it, and then he'll forward it on to you. So thank you very much, Kevin. I look forward to seeing you in person shortly, whether it's in Niagara Falls or back in Syracuse. But thank you very much for your time and your expertise in helping our industry.
No problem at all. And I hope I've heard they plan on opening the borders here soon. So looking forward to that.
Okay.